A very warm welcome to this year's Midsummer Macabre. As the world begins to open up again and we all venture out blinking into the sunlight, let us go cautiously. There's still a lot to be afraid of out there after all, as today's stories will graphically illustrate. Once again, I've delved into my little black book and conjured up some of the most wonderful people you could ever wish to be traumatized by. So, grab yourself a bracing drink and join us for a very memorable midsummer. Some years ago I published a novel which, I said in an interview around that time, draws together so many strands I wanted to write about for so many years and twists them all into a fantastic and apocalyptic vision. Whatever you want, it's in that book. Orgiastic witchcraft cults, evil babies, things from outer space, ghosts, devil dogs, mutants, depraved aristocrats, sinister henchmen, corpses coming up out of the ground, a love story, and, to a degree, the end of a world. But before I wrote that, and while thoughts of it were going around in my head, I wrote a short story using some of the themes and imagery and even scenes that would later go into the novel, which makes it, I guess, a kind of thematic prologue. Both that novel and this story are called The Cold Heart of Summer. Alyssa has a dream. She tells me about it Friday evening as we're curled up on the bed in my flat, which is only a little bigger than her car, but much more comfortable. We have some music playing, soft and smooth. I've set some candles up around the room and they're flickering gently in the breeze, blowing in off the sea, 3 streets distant, through the slightly raised window. Out there the sky is blue, like velvet. In here everything is orange and warm. It's a recurring dream she's had since childhood. She can't remember when it started or why, and she's never told anybody about it before. There's not much to it really, she tells me with a nervous laugh, but it's so frightening. It's the most frightening dream she's ever had, and she doesn't know why. And lately, it's been much more regular. She's alone, and it's night, and she's standing at the very end of a pier somewhere, staring out to sea. It's not one of the broad, garishly lit piers like we have propping this town up, but an ancient wooden thing, long and narrow enough for only one person. She can feel it sway beneath her as the sea laps at it. The pier is old, twisted by the elements until it resembles something from a funhouse or a fever. Behind her, she knows without looking, is so much nothing. Miles of darkness, empty fields and wet marshland. Not a single light to be seen. Nobody around to see or hear her. Nobody who could help if she should need it. Nobody to turn to for comfort. And before her it seems the same. The sky, vast and dark blue. The sea, vast and dark blue. A full moon, white as bleached bone, bloated as something pregnant or a teardrop waiting to fall, holds itself low in the sky, just above its shattered reflection in the sea. A reflection which seems like a jagged pathway right to the pier where she stands. If something were to step down from the moon, it need only follow the light, and it will find her. It's not merely the moon which is troubling her, terrible as it seems in this dream. Out there at the point where sea meets sky, a black line is thickening like spilled ink or blood, and she knows that a storm is brewing. Many miles out across the waves, the clouds will be churning and black as sin, black as utter despair. The waves will be rising, angry and agitated, and this storm will be heading towards her. It's already on its way. She wants to be away from here, but doesn't want to run. Whether she is held immobile by fear or the thought of turning and fleeing towards the impenetrable darkness with a storm at her heels, she doesn't know. But the longer she stands there, the more she feels as though she has been left out here like some kind of sacrifice to whatever is on its way. And it comes within, or in the form of, this storm. Veins of ice-white lightning race across the agitated clouds, stirring up yet more darkness. The waves are growing. Out at sea they are huge things that could sweep away ships and still be hungry for coastal villages by the time they reach land. She can see them with a clarity terribly unaffected by distance, gigantic claws of something down beneath the water tearing at the sky. This storm, so much worse than any that she, or even the world, has ever seen before, is on its way towards her with a speed and power that is nothing less than awesome, and nothing less than terrifying. The sky and the sea rage, and Alyssa waits for what she hopes will be the end, and not merely of everything that she knows. She can feel the first of its physical presence already, the fine spray thrown up from the waves that will soon be holding themselves, however briefly, so high above her. And the moon looks down, cold, unloving, awful. Before he died, my father researched myth and folklore. There's still a wealth of books on the subject up in the converted attic of my parents' house, and I used to sometimes wander around in there when I visited my mother. There was even his telescope set in front of the skylight at the back of the house, now and probably forever capped and blind. There's so much myth based around the moon, but none of it very pleasant. In ancient myth, it was seen as something which took back the souls of the dead and where they would wait for rebirth. People have believed there to be some kind of man in the moon even before the associated deities with it. Falling asleep outdoors with the light of it shining upon you was said to drive you insane. Long before the days of artificial lighting, the full moon became associated with magic, and witches were said to have the power to draw down the moon from the sky. Indeed, modern-day Wiccans still perform a symbolic version of this rite. But I have no doubt that some things are best left alone. There's an old local myth that I came across in my father's notebooks one day. I don't like to think about it. It may even have something to do with why I stopped looking through his papers, stopped going into that crowded little room beneath the sloping roof beams with its fading scents of pipe smoke and leather. It was a story in which the people of this area bore witness to a month in which 2 full moons hung side by side in the night sky. Summer brings a fitful tourist trade to town, or at least stirs up some of the locals who hide away for the rest of the year. I go walking one evening, following the smell of a sea to the promenade and the amusement arcade on the pier, huge and tired-looking, yet stuffed with light, like a skull that's been used as a light shade. If anything, the increased trade makes me, or the town, feel lonelier. There's something desperate about all the milling around, faltering grins as sunburnt faces cool off in the evening darkness and look around for something to please them. The tired drone and chatter and clunk of the old machines stirred into life after being impregnated by a coin or two. But things have been weighing on my mind lately, and I find I'm not sleeping so well. It feels like I'm living through the world's growing pains, but I sincerely hope that's an idea, as ridiculous as it sounds. When the light and noise and crowds fail to reassure me, I turn and leave. I used to love walking along the promenade, right to the top of a hill and looking back on the lights of a little old town spread out before me. I used to love the night sky, the roar of the surf. These things are being tainted day by day. I don't want to look up at the moon, obscenely swollen, and the swelling of the waves makes me uncomfortable. The sea seems to be fighting against something, pushing its way out, reaching for the sky. Down on the beach, a drunk is staggering. I imagine he's drunk because of the way he moves and how he is yelling to himself. Either distance or his condition render the words unintelligible, though he seems to be beating at his own head. A dog is following from a wary distance, slinking between the struts of a pier. Its eyes glimmer coldly. I'm seeing a lot of strange things lately. We argue. About what, it's not important. As so often, when lovers fight, the reason is trivial and soon forgotten. I wasn't sorry straight away. For a whole half an hour, I was glad that she stormed out of my flat, and when she didn't come back almost immediately, and I heard her car start up down on the street, I used my anger to justify those feelings. She came back hours later, looking like I'd never seen her before, pale, childlike, helpless. There's no question of either one of us having to say we were sorry, no discussion about what had gone on between us. The fight was way down on the list of priorities, and I wanted only to hold her and make her feel better, and she, in turn, wanted only to be held and to feel better. I was able to hold her, if nothing else. I think it's going to take a great deal before either of us feel better again. Most of the time, I don't think that will ever happen now. I held her until daylight came and banished some of the darkness, and in that time she told me what had happened after she'd left that night. And then neither one of us spoke until the morning. There was nothing to say. You know how when you're ill, there's this one thing wrong with you and it's all you can think about, and right then you just want to be normal again. Right now I just want the world to be normal again. But I've got a horrible feeling that this illness is terminal. After she'd left, Alyssa just wanted to go and cool down. The argument, whatever it had been, had wound her up and left her feeling angry and a little sad and even a little stupid, as is the way of meaningless fights. She got in her car, slammed the door, pulled out of a tight space. She headed back along the promenade past the pier and the amusement arcade. A gang of teenagers watch from inside their hoods. They may as well be cowled ghosts for all that is visible of them. The lights and noise seem as repulsive to her as they did to me when I visited during the week, and she drives across the bridge into the town centre, which at this time was mostly dead. Along the one-way system, past the harbour and the docks, and then towards the outskirts of town. When the street lamps fall away, there is only the pale darkness of a summer night sky, and she winds the window down to enjoy the calming breeze, already beginning to feel a little better, hearing the soft crash of the waves from just out of sight. The road leads uphill past the lighthouse and then away towards the next town, some 7 miles distant. She wants only solitude, and she pulls off the road onto a narrow track that leads towards a seafront car park. Quiet even during the day, this far from the tourist traps of the town centre, at this hour she is surprised to see even one more vehicle here. A small van parked in the dead centre of the front row, facing out to sea. Perhaps somebody like herself, she thinks, who just needs to relax after a bitch of a day. She parks parallel to it 20 yards to the right and switches off her engine to let the sounds of the night gently fall in upon her. There's a contradictory calmness about the sea. Despite the endless raging of the waves breaking themselves apart upon the earth as the impenetrably black depths urge them on, anyone who's spent time on the shore will know what I mean. It's a beautiful sight and a beautiful sound, even if I'm becoming increasingly unsettled by it these days. Alyssa sits staring out at the wine-dark sea beneath the moonlight, and of course her nightmare is never far from her mind. She tries to relax, lets out a long shuddering breath, and along with it much of the tension that has built up since our silly fight. Tears come to her eyes and she sinks forward into her hands. After a few seconds, she remembers the van parked nearby and hopes she isn't creating an unwittingly interesting diversion for the occupant. She glances out, across at the vehicle, and this is what she sees. At first, only the van, the sort that might belong to a self-employed tradesman. There are no markings on its side, but a discoloured patch where a logo may once have been. Then she sees the occupant, a middle-aged man the wrong side of plump, sitting in the darkness of the interior and staring out to sea. Relieved that she hasn't drawn attention to herself, Alyssa is about to turn away when she notices the man's mouth moving, and as she can clearly see he is alone, at first assumes he's using a hands-free phone, but then changes her mind. His mouth looks less like it is talking than writhing involuntarily. She knows she shouldn't be staring and yet is unable to tear her gaze away. His lips writhe and twist and his own mouth seems to be intent upon sliding around his face. There's something so unusual in the sight that it is compelling, horribly fascinating in the way that only utter strangeness can be. There must be something wrong with the man, she thinks, and she really mustn't stare. Yet here comes his hand to wave at her, and he must have seen her after all. No, he's not waving. Indeed, he's still staring straight ahead, out at the sinuous waves rushing the concrete wall beyond the car park. His hand seems to be slapping at the window of the van, as though eager to fly out into the night. She wonders if he's having some kind of fit or seizure. Perhaps she should get out and try to help in some way. And yet an awful feeling of wrongness pins her to her seat, as effectively as a stake. The man is struggling with his hands. He has no control over them, and his face looks anguished as he stares out at the sea. His hands flail around, and it must be only the movement which makes Alyssa think that there seem to be too many of them. But what then causes them to bat against the window like moths, unnaturally long fingers with far too many knuckles tapping against the glass? It couldn't be happening. No hands could look like these ones do. No hands could be so uncontrollable. No fingers so many-jointed. She wants desperately to look away. The faster they move, the more there seem to be of them, and the longer they seem to be, until she can barely see the man's face, his twisting mouth, beyond the network of branches that his hands have become. But when his head snaps to one side and his eyes focus on her, she finds the strength to twist the key in the ignition and bring the car to life. Alyssa was frightened of many things right at that moment. She was frightened that the car wouldn't start, and as soon as it did, that it would fail and leave her stranded, that she might have to leave its meagre security and run into the darkness. She was frightened that the van would follow her, perhaps overtake her or run her off the road, and that she would find out all too well just what was happening to its bizarre occupant. She tried to concentrate and to not look at the van, as though the sight of whatever was going on in there might be enough to freeze her into inaction once more. But she couldn't help a glimpse from the corner of her eye as she turned the car for the exit. She could still see the silently screaming face, though less and less of it behind the blur of active and unnatural fingers beating themselves bloody against the glass. She kept watch of a van in the rearview mirror until the trees that loomed over the road began to seem too threatening, and she watched them as she drove uphill, wishing to reassure herself that it was only a sea breeze that was causing them to twist and shake. The van and its occupant didn't follow her. They may still be there now, though I don't want to think about what state they're in. If there had been some kind of resolution or climax to the unnerving incident, then, funnily enough, I don't think it would have seemed so bad if it had wrapped itself up in some neat little package like things always do in the movies or in books. But the fact that it didn't feels unbearably foreboding. Strange things are happening out there in the town, in the night, beneath the moon. I wish I could reassure Alyssa, reassure myself, but this can only get worse. We're only seeing the beginning of the end. In a variant of a local legend in my father's research, that second full moon in the sky hadn't been a moon at all. It was an egg sac, the story goes, laid by something that was drawn out of the cold depths of space by the witchcraft that used to go on in these parts. Shortly after the two moons had been seen in the sky, there was a meteor shower which rained down around the area for 3 nights. By the time it was finished, there was only one moon left again, waning back into the darkness of the night sky. The seeds had been laid, it said, and in time something would grow. There's a full moon coming. Out there in the inky black sky, it grows fatter night by night, bloated with its weirdness. The moon pulls at the earth, draws the tides of the sea and of its seed. It calls its children, and they are growing up through the earth, up through the town around us, its trees, animals and people. We're going to see a lot of strange things by the time the moon is full. And I don't know if we'll want to live to see another one.
Hello, and welcome to Midsummer Macabre. I'm Alison Littlewood, and I've published several books under my own name, and more recently The Cottingley Cuckoo under the name A.J. Elwood. Today I'm going to read for you one of my short stories. This is The July Girls, an abridged version of a story that was published in Ellen Datlow's Echoes anthology. Sophia didn't knock. It was my room, but she thought she owned everything. People who looked like her always did. I was lying on my bed reading a school textbook when she walked in, her blonde hair shining in the lamplight. All that glitters. I pictured my own hair, dull, average length and an average colour. Mouse, her name for me. Oh, is Ickle Mousey working? Hasn't Ickle Mousey any friends? I didn't answer as she crossed to my window and tugged at the catch. I knew what she was up to. From my room, she could run across the extension's flat roof and jump onto the banking behind the house. Someone would be waiting for her at the gate, most likely someone wearing a leather jacket and holding the keys to a car. I could have spoiled everything for her then, but I didn't call out as she swung her leg over the sill and ducked through the window. I heard the scrape of her feet on the roof, then nothing, and all I thought was, I hope you get pregnant. I hope you ruin your life. And then I remember the thought as clearly as if I'd spoken it. At least this means you're gone. Mum and my stepdad went quiet after Sophia died. The rooms went quiet too, only the dust seeming to move, turning in on itself while time did the same. Familiar objects, tainted by the atmosphere, went stale somehow, as if they belonged to a world that moved more slowly than it should. But the biggest change of all was that I could breathe again. It was Sophia's dad who told me about Cornwall. He sidled into my room as if he was ashamed of being alive when his daughter was dead, and he reached out and picked something up from my shelf. It was a photograph in a picture frame. It showed two girls. One had sleek blonde hair, the other was me. It was taken on sports day at school. She'd been picked for the 100 metres, while I'd have been lucky to do an egg and spoon race. Our smiles looked the same, but they weren't. She'd been making eyes at her current crush, and I was smiling because someone told me to. What a lovely picture, he said. I had no idea. And he looked at me, really saw me for the first time in weeks. Then he said we were going away, and I remembered Cornwall's busy little harbours, the salty taste of chips, and the sunlight on skin that would not grow cold like hers, that would not putrefy as hers must have, whatever skin she'd still possessed. We'll relive some old memories, he said, the three of us. And he left me to stare at the photograph he'd replaced on my shelf. I didn't have the first idea how it had come to be there. He'd assumed I'd chosen it, but I never would have. I went to shove it under the bed, or in the bin, and remembered the way he'd looked at me, and instead I put it back on the shelf. I didn't face it towards the room, though, where I'd have to see it. I turned it to the door, where anyone would notice it as they came in. The long queue of traffic on the A30 gave way to single-track lanes, walled in by tall hedges thick with flowers and birdsong. Most tourists stayed by the coast, but my family preferred to be somewhere quieter still, a drive away from the beaches and the crowds. Mum came into my room while I was unpacking. I pulled a hoodie from my suitcase, and she noticed what lay beneath. What's that? She reached in and picked up something rectangular and heavy, something I hadn't packed, something that didn't belong. The frame was broad-edged and silver. I had seen it before. I didn't want to look at it again, but the smiles flashed at me as she tilted it. That's so sweet, she said. Come down when you're ready. I think I nodded, but couldn't be certain. My face barely felt like my own. How had the photo got there? Had my stepdad slipped it into my suitcase? Did he think he was doing something nice? I shoved the picture in among the spare blankets in the wardrobe. I'd have to think about Sophia enough if we were going to relive old memories. I didn't have to look at her too. Later, we went for a walk, stepping out into evening sunshine and the humming of bees. We didn't talk about Sophia, but she was there. I could almost see her walking ahead of me, putting her arms around her dad and my mum, leaving me to follow. And yet this, if anywhere, was where we'd been closest. With nothing else to do and no one to see, we'd spent time together, walking along these lanes, splashing into crystal clear water, our two smiles just the same. We were the image of girls on holiday then, July girls, Mum had called us. And maybe Sophia really was here. I couldn't really believe her dad had packed that photo. Maybe Sophia had brought it here herself. Maybe she wanted to tell me something, to let me know that despite all our arguments and bitchy comments, it was okay. We turned a corner in the lane and I saw the opening in the hedge which led to a path I remembered, and I stopped dead. "Are you all right, love?" Mum's tone was all concern. I said I was just tired, and she walked on, but we soon turned back. I didn't look at the path again, but I could picture it, the nettles and rose bay willow herb hemming it in, the keep out sign, the clearing beyond that. By the time we reached the cottage, chill shadows were clawing their way along the lanes. I saw the picture as soon as I opened the bedroom door. It was on my bedside table, two smiles shining out like sunshine, like summer. I yanked open a drawer. It was empty apart from a Bible that had been left there, and I shoved the picture underneath, hoping it might help keep her from coming back again. I sat on the bed and stared into space for a long time. I didn't see the room. I only saw Sophia, her perfect skin, her perfect life. And I told myself this was my place now, my time. It was me who had the second biggest room. Both our parents were mine. I could have anything that had once been hers, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. Later, I awoke in darkness more complete than I'd ever experienced at home. I couldn't see a thing, and yet all my reassurances drained away because I could feel someone standing in the room. I opened my mouth to whisper, "Mum," and closed it again. It wasn't my mum. I knew that. I reached for the lamp, hesitating, as an image of Sophia rose before me. It was Sophia as she truly was now, dead. Mutilated, as she had been when her stupid boyfriend turned his motorbike over, skidding along the tarmac, dragging her with it. She wasn't wearing a helmet. That hadn't been her style. I suppose she liked to have that golden hair flying behind her in the breeze. From what I'd overheard, her face had been scraped raw. Now I felt her standing on the other side of that darkness, and pictured her face, flayed and bloody, but still with that lovely hair, still with that look in her eyes. I switched on the light. The room was empty. The picture, however, was back again. I could almost have touched it when I reached for the lamp. There was Sophia in all her beauty. I stared into her face, trying to make out what lay beneath. When I awoke, I examined the picture again. It hadn't changed, and as I stared at it, I cast my mind back to our last holiday here. It was Mum who'd told us to go for a walk. I suppose she'd thought we might come back best friends. Sophia and I had met Lucy in the lane. About our age, her hair was sun-bleached almost white, her eyebrows pale against her tanned skin. She told us she lived here year-round, in a farmhouse her dad was restoring. It's a tip, she'd said, and there's nothing to do, except... That except led us along the lane, swatting at midges as we went. Lucy and Sophia went in front, and when we reached the path they didn't pause, just pushed through the waist-high weeds. We reached a copse where low branches barred the way, along with a keep out sign hanging from a sagging chain. Lucy grinned and stepped over. She led us to a clearing with a mound of earth at its centre, covered with tussocky grass. "It's a fugu," she said. "There's a hidden chamber. No one comes here, no one's bothered. There's a better one at Carnuni, and a few others. This one's all ours, if you dare." Dare? Sophia was interested at last. Something twisted in my stomach. There was a small opening at the base of the mound, a foot or so high, lined with crooked stones. I imagined crawling into it, but that couldn't be what she meant. It was probably dangerous. "It's Iron Age," she went on. "No one knows what they were for. I reckon it was a burial chamber. Some call them halts, or fuggy holes, or vows. It's not far, but first there's the creep." Sophia's gaze shot to me, a new kind of amusement in her eyes. Some say the little folk still haunt it. Pixies, piskies. Pigsies, Sophia said, her gaze on me, and she giggled. I looked away, seeing the lowering branches that hemmed us in, the pure whiteness of the clouds scattered across the sky. This place felt impossibly distant from anywhere, as if it existed outside time itself. Does she talk? Lucy said, and Sophia let out a trill of laughter. You don't want her to. Boring. So what's the dare? Lucy pointed to the hole. Sophia fanned out her hair, showing off its clean fineness, as if to say, really? It's a squeeze, Lucy said. There's no mortar holding the stones together. There's one bit. The roof gets lower. You have to wriggle. Come on, then. Sophia was still watching me. Of course she was. She'd seen my fear. Now she would push at it, see how deep it went. The moss inside glows, Lucy said. It's phosphorescent. It's not that rare. It's just don't normally get to see it like that. Like magic. Sophia waved a hand in a who cares gesture. But I did care. Glowing moss. That was something I would like to see. But there was no way I was going in there. I couldn't give up the clean air and the sun for whatever lay inside that hole. Not even to share an adventure with Sophia. To try to mend whatever it was between us. Sophia shrugged and slid, neat as an eel, into the hole, her legs wriggling as she disappeared. Lucy didn't wait for me. I watched as she too vanished into the dark. I sat on a fallen branch and waited. Above me, the clouds went by, time passing in another world. Here there was silence. I couldn't hear birds singing, or insects humming, or distant cars in the lane. And the thought struck me, what if they didn't come out? I'd have to go in after them. I thought of crawling into the hole, feeling for them blindly in the dark, finding Sophia's face under my hands, unconscious perhaps, overcome by stale air. I imagined wriggling backwards, trying to pull her with me, and not being able to move her. I pictured Lucy in the chamber behind Sophia, wedged in, helpless. Sophia, the body, between us, and me, stuck in the place where the roof lowered, unable to go forward or back. I walked over to the hole in the ground. There was no light in there and no voices. Then I thought I saw a greenish glow, and I heard laughter, distorted, as if from a great distance away. Then something moved. I started back, and they came spilling out. They laughed, frightened and relieved, and together, bonded, the two of them, like sisters. Sophia leapt to her feet and reached out a hand, and without a second's thought Lucy took it, and Sophia pulled her to her feet. They didn't look at me. Sophia didn't talk to me all the way home. Now I sat on the bed, clutching the photograph, wondering if things would have been different if I'd gone with her, if I was the one who'd taken her hand. The picture was lifted from me, and I looked up to see my mother. By her expression, I knew she thought I'd brought the picture here out of love for Sophia, and I couldn't bear it. She hated me, I said. What, love? I hated her too. She sank down next to me, cradling the picture like a child. Oh, sweetie, I know you didn't always get on, but people don't. It doesn't mean they can't find a way to live together. It doesn't mean they didn't love each other. I leaned against her, and she rubbed my back like when I was little. I told myself she was right. We'd have got past the pettiness and jealousy sooner or later. Hadn't Sophia moved beyond it already? She was dead. I surely couldn't think so badly of her any longer. We spent the next day by the sea, the waves glittering, the sand shining so whitely in the sun, I had to shield my eyes. It reminded me of Sophia and me at our best, the July girls, and the salt air gave me an appetite and a good kind of tiredness. But when we got back to the cottage, I didn't go to bed. Without telling anyone, I packed a few items in a backpack and crept downstairs. It seemed appropriate to Sophia's memory to sneak out. The path was quiet. Everything smelled of sap and growth and nectar. The sign was still there, hanging from its chain, its letters more faded than they had been, and I stepped over. I hadn't seen anyone else, and I wondered if Lucy still lived here, or if she'd moved on, as people do, at least those who were still alive. The clearing was just as it had been. It could almost have been that same day, as if it was always summer here, always July. The hole in the ground hadn't been filled in or fenced over or sealed as I'd half expected. The grey stones around it still looked like teeth. Hungry. But I knew it was only a short passage to the chamber. When I reached it, I'd take the things from my backpack, a candle and a box of matches, and I would light the candle for Sophia, to let her know that after all we were family. Some call them vows, Lucy had said. Well, this would be my vow to Sophia, to remember her as she would have wanted me to. I knelt by the hole. I could only see a short way in, an arched passageway lined by more stones, then nothing. I grabbed my mobile and switched on its torch, ducked inside and started to crawl. The torch wasn't much use. The roof was lower than I'd expected, and when I tried to look ahead, stone brushed against my hair. Instead, I looked down at the dry earth. The air was a constant cold in here, chilling my skin, and there was a smell like old bones, grave dirt and thyme. I shuffled forward and hit my head on a lower stone jutting from the roof. I rubbed it, then held my hand before my face, trying to see if there was blood. I tried to peer down the passageway, shining the light into it. The centre of the tunnel was black, nothing to catch its beam, though I thought I could see where the roof bulged downwards. What had Lucy said? You have to wriggle. Sophia had done this, and so would I. I'd be back at the cottage within the hour, and this time I'd put the picture away somewhere, and she wouldn't bring it back, because I'd have laid her to rest, because, if she could see what I was doing, she'd be happy. I pushed aside the panic clouding the edges of my vision. I knew I couldn't hold the torch any longer, not through the squeeze, and it was little use anyway. I slipped it into my jeans pocket and flattened myself against the earth. I pushed with my feet, pulling with my hands, feeling my way. I ducked under where I thought the low stone was, and felt colder air against my scalp. Was that the chamber? Then my backpack caught. For a moment I froze. Why hadn't I taken it off before I crept in here? But I hadn't stopped to think. I'd almost forgotten it, since it weighed so little. Yet now it felt heavier and unwieldy. It wouldn't help me to panic. I pictured the extra handle on the top of the backpack for carrying it with one hand. That must have snagged on something. Another wriggle would free it. I shuffled an inch or two backwards, and the straps around my arms tightened. My breaths came too loud and too fast. I couldn't believe I was doing this for Sophia, like a mouse scurrying through a tunnel. But I wasn't scurrying. I couldn't move. There was no give in the straps holding me in place, and there was no light, none at all. I couldn't even reach my phone. I closed my eyes and opened them again as wide as I could. Nothing. And there was no air. I gasped, my lungs straining. What had I been thinking? I had to get out. I shuffled backwards once more, and the straps around my arms grew tighter still. I wriggled as hard as I could. I imagined the strap of my backpack caught on a loose stone. The arch was held in place by the way those stones were arranged, each doing their part, sharing its share of the load. What would happen if one of them fell? But if I moved forwards again, it would be all right. Anything else just wasn't possible. A few hours ago, I'd been paddling in the pure, clear sea. I'd squinted against the sun shining on white sand and wished it wasn't so bright. I wished it was brighter now. I wished I was there, but soon I would be. Tomorrow I would run in mad circles in the water, and Mum would laugh at me, not knowing the reason why. And the thought came to me that no one knew where I was. I pictured the distance between us, the clearing, the trees, the lane. They wouldn't hear me, no matter how loud I shouted. My screams would only fill the chamber, echoing back at me, driving me mad. I wasn't stuck. I couldn't be. Soon, in the chamber, I'd shrug off the backpack as easily as ever. I made myself as flat as I could and tried to drag myself forwards, my nails breaking against the ground, and I felt something give. I slid forward an inch and then was caught again, and there came, as clear as daylight, the sound of glass breaking. I shifted my weight and heard another glassy sound from my back. I knew what it was. I pictured the photograph. 2 girls smiling into the dark, their faces obscured now by cracked glass. It was the photograph that I hadn't kept, hadn't packed, hadn't wanted to see. The one that Sophia had brought to me, in case I forgot her, just in case I felt able to breathe again. I imagined the picture frame, bulky and heavy, jutting from inside my backpack. Because she'd put it there, hadn't she? Had that picture frame wedged itself into a gap between the stones? If I moved, would it prise them loose? I rested my cheek in the dirt, and without volition, a memory came. It was sports day. Sophia had been surrounded by her friends, only coming over to me to pose for our picture. I remembered the way she looked over at her boyfriend, and I remembered the way that I had too. The way I'd looked at her perfect skin, her golden hair, her life. Had I wanted it all so very badly? Later that day, she'd found me. This time she hadn't smiled. She hadn't spoken. We weren't the July girls. Not then. We never had been. I remembered her hands clawing in my hair, the way I hit the ground, the weight on my chest as she knelt on my back, pushing my face into the dirt. Stay down, bitch. Just stay down, or I swear I'll bury you. I started to struggle. I couldn't lift my head, couldn't move, but I would get out because I had to. Soon I would get out. I felt the touch of fingers in my hair, there and then gone. I let out a sob, and an answering sound came. A whisper. This place didn't feel empty, not any longer. But of course it wasn't empty. Sophia had come to me and put the picture into my bag. Something to remind me of her, if anything were needed. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't forgiven. Sophia was here, and she hated me. She hated me because I was jealous. She hated me because I wanted everything she had. She hated me because she was dead and I was alive, but I didn't know how to live. Not really. Not without her to show me how. But still, I was alive. I gasped in a breath, tasting only the earth. I shoved with all my strength, and there was a dull scrape, and suddenly I moved. I shot forwards, but the sound was growing, a far-off rumbling that was getting closer and louder, and the world came down. I think I screamed, but I couldn't hear it because that noise was all around me. I waited for the earth to fill my mouth, but it didn't. It was my legs and my back it took, and I waited for the pain to begin. It didn't. Not yet. It was coming, though, getting closer every second. For now, there was only an awful, intense pressure. I tried to move my legs, even to wriggle my toes. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't twist my head. It felt as if someone was kneeling on my back. Stay down, bitch. I'll bury you. I let everything go limp, tasting despair at the back of my throat. The tunnel must be blocked. No one could look into it, see me there, and pull me free. The air would be cut off. Soon it would go stale. I started to shout, inarticulate sounds without words. I think I screamed. And I felt those fingers again, running through my hair, easing it away from my face, stroking my skin, as if in comfort. It quieted me. And I realised I could see something after all. There was no light to see by, yet something gleamed before my eyes. It was growing brighter, and my breath caught. I could see a glow, unmistakable, and it wasn't moss. It was hair, gleaming, golden, lovely hair. Sophia did not speak. She had no need of words. She had already said everything she wanted to say. She knew how I had wished for everything she had. Now, she wanted to share it with me. Here, in the dark and the cold, she had decided to be my sister, after all.
Hello everyone, my name is Paul Finch. I'm very pleased to be participating in Midsummer Macabre. I'd like to read a short story of mine called Children Don't Play Here Anymore. It was first published in 2004 as in an anthology called Quietly Now, which was a tribute to the late great American author Charles L. Grant. Jeff slows his Chrysler to a halt on the road called Woodcock Close. It is a cul-de-sac, as its name suggests, with a turning circle at the end and detached middle-class houses at regular intervals along its western side. Opposite these, on the east, the ground flows away downhill, a rough, uncultivated pasture of brambles, ragwort and rich, thick meadow grass. At the bottom, perhaps 200 yards down from Woodcock Close, a dense stand of trees encloses a woodland pond. Beyond this there is a fenced-off paddock, which is periodically used for exercising dressage horses, though the stately residence to which it belongs lies half a mile to the north, only accessible from the paddock by a winding unmade lane, and when you reach it, well concealed within a manicured spinning of sculpted evergreens. Out of sight, out of mind, and thus unattached to the green and pleasant area that lies below Woodcock Close, tucked away like a secret garden. While dreary enough in the winter, unless there is snow, in which case it becomes an exceptional sledge and toboggan run, this small but hidden valley is a magical place at every other time of the year. It is no more than 10 or 12 areas in total size, yet in appearance at least it is deep, secluded, mysterious, even though in reality it sits in the heart of the town's sprawling suburbs and is perhaps only 5 minutes' walk from the ever-rumbling M6 motorway. Locals like us have always known it as the Dell, and probably every generation of our boys going back to the pre-war years waged their own battles down in its leafy heart, explored their own jungles, fought their own dinosaurs, built their own tree houses and swung on their own makeshift rope swings. But that was then, and this is now. And children don't play in the Dell anymore. You know, Dad, Jeff says as he parks, you don't have to do this. I know, I reply. It's not as if you've got anything to prove. I consider his words, which I hear every time we come here, and then take my stick from the footwell. You really expect to find something, he asks, after so long? I throw him a look, one of those short, shrewish looks I increasingly throw at people these days, and which I've recently made a mental note to try and clamp down on. It isn't that. You know it isn't that. I know. His voice softens. He smiles sympathetically. It's become an annual pilgrimage, this, hasn't it? Something like that. I button up my overcoat and climb from the car. It is a cool day in early September. It would probably be warm if not for the gentle easterly breeze which rustles like paper in the grass atop the dell. The sun is mellow and misted in a pebble blue sky, against which the foliage of the woodland below is bright emerald in colour, deep and succulent in texture. I wish you wouldn't do it, though. Jeff climbs out of the car on the other side. He nods at my stick and at my slight grimace of pain as I straighten my ever-creaking back. I mean, you're not going to be able to get up and down that hill much longer, not at your age. But I'm not sure whether this is an intended wind-up. I'm only 67, you know, I remind him. He doesn't smile, which means that it isn't a wind-up at all. You're a 67-year-old with chronic sciatica. Well, you'll be around to help me, won't you, if things get tough? I use that terse, fatherly tone, which always suggests that you're telling your son something rather than asking him. He shakes his head as he slips his rolled-up newspaper from his jacket pocket. Oh, no, I'm not helping you punish yourself. No way. He leans back against the car and starts to read. I'll happily give you a lift here, so long as you want to come. But that's as far as it goes. I watch him for a long moment. He's a handsome enough man, my son. 39 now and with a growing-up family of his own. He still looks youngish, though. His hair is jet black and thickly layered. He plays football at weekends and looks after himself as his tall, spare physique suggests. People have always said that he reminds them of me, but I don't see that in him at all. If anything, his smooth, almost refined features resemble his mother's. Though the same certainly can't be said for his attitude. Jeff has always been a man's man, and I suppose by that I mean energetic, self-assured, cocky, confident, and generally speaking a good provider for his wife and children. But at the same time he can be domineering, insensitive, occasionally boorish when the drink is on him, and mildly selfish where the non-material needs of his loved ones are concerned. I can't fault him for any of that, I suppose. The modern male isn't nearly so progressive an animal as people like to imagine. The main difference between him and the old-fashioned model is that he makes a pretense of putting others first, but it only goes as far as that. Maybe in that respect Jeff is like me. When my family were growing up, I never saw a great deal of them, and even though that was because of work, I wasn't half as astute at my job as Jeff currently is in the computer business he runs. At least I didn't make it pay as well, so at the end of the day you may ask, what was it all for? He senses me watching him and glances up. Okay? I nod and half smile. Fine, just running over a few things. Wants a copper, eh? I nod again. Back in 5, okay? No problem, he says, getting back to his reading. All over Britain, I guess, and probably in other countries too, parents these days seem to be more mindful of where their children are and what they're getting up to. The tabloids and daily newsreels are too filled with lurid, ghoulish stories to render them anything else. In the UK, the murders of children by strangers are said to be lower in number now than they were in the mid-1970s, but that must be because grown-ups are simply more vigilant, less prepared to let their very young go out and play unsupervised, and are especially wary of scenic but isolated spots like the Dell. In that respect, the Andrew Conroy case won't be the only reason why kids don't hang out around here anymore, but it certainly can't have helped. As I perambulate downhill, it strikes me as immensely sad how modern children are denied the youth of wild adventure that Jeff and others like him enjoyed. A wood like the one at the bottom of the dell should not be silent and filled with undisturbed shadows. Courting couples sneaking off into its undergrowth should not go unspied upon. Tadpole-filled ponds like the one deep in the middle here should not remain unplundered. But that is the way of it these days, and with good reason. The murder of Andrew Conroy was really quite horrible. More so from my point of view, perhaps because I knew the kid personally. He was a contemporary of Jeff's, went to the same school and scout troop, was a member of the same swimming club. Don't ever believe it if someone tells you that police detectives get hardened to the slaughter of the innocents. Especially don't believe it if those police detectives happen to work in their hometown. It was his 11th birthday, and young Andrew had gone down to the dell to see if any of his pals were around. That was all anyone really knew about it. His body was discovered 7 hours later, under a bush and covered with leaves. He'd been bludgeoned to death with a brick, then sexually interfered with. We made fingertip searches through those woods for the next 3 weeks, ran door to doors throughout the district, questioned every possible in the town and their families over and over again, but to no avail. This happened in 1975, still 9 years before the first DNA breakthroughs would be made, but even if we'd had that level of crime-busting technology available, it's unlikely we'd have made progress. The killer was either too clever or too lucky, because there was minimal evidence to go on. The murder weapon which we recovered had been thrown into the pond and thus was washed clean of fingerprints. It had been a dry summer day, the ground firm, the turf lush and springy, which meant there were no usable foot impressions. Nobody living in the nearest houses had seen or heard anything untoward. Public appeals for information drew a blank. No one, it seemed, knew a damn thing. I headed up the investigation, being already a seasoned detective, and if I couldn't make ground on the murderer, nobody could, people said. They usually said that while giving me a conciliatory slap on the shoulder. I still remember those slaps, though I remember them more these days like the blows of a whip. I reached the bottom of the slope, not without some huffing and puffing, because meadow grass grows deep and tussocky at this time of year, and as I've already hinted, I'm not the sprightliest 67-year-old. Anyway, I reached the bottom, and the wood stands before me. There is nothing dark or sinister about it. Sunlight slants through its open spaces. Its leaf canopy whispers in the breeze. Somewhere in the higher boughs a woodpecker jackhammers away. Rural idyll. It bespeaks pure rural idyll. Man knew it probably did the same on that fateful day in 1975. I press on in, having to tread carefully. Various pathways once wound back and forth through the miniature coppice. Clear, well-trodden routes that served as ably for bicycle tyres as they did for pairs of trainer-clad feet. The fact that they are now largely invisible, submerged under dense profusions of thorns and bracken, tells its own story. There are sections of them I have to beat my way through using my stick like a machete. Here and there my trousers snag, Strands of briar conspire to tangle my ankles and try to trip me, but I am resolute. I will keep going, because all the way through there are melancholy reminders of what this place once meant. In a high elm close to the centre of the wood, a few mildewed planks lie balanced between the branches, one hanging loose from a rusted nail. These are all that remain of a carefully constructed tree house. It hailed from an era long prior to my sons, but consecutive generations adopted it as their own, each one making its own renovations and improvements. I remember Jeff telling me how he and his cronies put a carpet up there and cushions and hung a polythene roof over the top. There was even a rumour that someone had provided a stash of girly magazines for it, snaffled from the barber's shop by an understanding older brother. Further along, I come to the pond itself. It occupies a low, shady hollow in the very centre of the wood, and at this time of year is only just filling up again, recovering from the annual dry season that is August. Already, though, it has scummed over. It looks soup-like, stagnant. Clearly, no one has been fishing here or has even poked about in it. One particularly wet year, when the surface of this pond had risen a foot or so higher than usual, Jeff and other kids like him, Andrew Conroy among them I expect, built themselves a raft and spent the entire summer poling their way barefoot from one end of it to the other. High above it, and now out of reach, a ravel of rotted strings are all that is left of the once infamous rope swing. More than a few youngsters came splashing down from that in their time, thankfully not injuring themselves seriously. These days I imagine the weight of a squirrel would suffice to break it. I carry on, hacking my way through swaths of vegetation, and sense the trees close in behind me, blotting out all trace of the grassy slope and the neat row of houses at the top. Just ahead, what was once the path will soon split into two, the left-hand route bending back on itself to loop around the other side of the pond, the right-hand route meandering deeper and deeper between the ranks of ash and juniper, finally terminating at the fence on the edge of the horse's paddock. As I understand it, this was once the place for youngsters to come to if they wanted to watch the prize-winning animals get put through their paces, or to feed them lush tufts of elephant grass. Unfortunately, it has different connotations now. I never cease to feel a cold breath on my neck as I approach this spot. You'll understand if I explain that the first time I personally came here was to view a wide taped-off area with a police tarpaulin erected over it as a rainproof tent. No evidence of that remains now, but the atmosphere is the same. In fact, in some respects, it is worse. Because the spiky hawthorn bush under which Andrew Conroy's battered, violated body had been stuffed has now grown up and out, turning into a young tree. This in itself is enough to create a menacing shadow in the once sunny glade. But to make matters worse, the small embankment along which the barbed wire fence was erected proved an insufficient anchorage for the growing tree's spreading root system. As such, it tore loose from the upper ground some time ago, and now leans backward across what was left of the open space, its high branches intermingling with those of the adjoining hazel and alder, creating a partial roof through which scarcely a lick of sunlight can penetrate. Other items of underbrush have grown up along the fence beside it, thus blocking off any sight of the dressage field and enclosing the forgotten murder scene in a den or hide entirely of its own. I stand there as I always do, gazing on the bare earth and thinking about Andrew Conroy. He was a pleasing enough youth, red-haired, happy-faced. I didn't know him so well. I don't think he ever once came to our house. As I recall, he was a little bit backward in some respects, what they called a remedial in those days, but now probably referred to as special needs. I'll never forget watching him be collected from school while I was waiting there for Jeff. Either his mother or his older sister would come, and they'd be all smiles as they walked side by side with him out of the yard, nodding and listening as he told them excitedly about his day. That memory alone is enough to bring a tear to my eye. As a murder detective, you only need to fail one victim and you've failed them all. From a distance, particularly when it is portrayed in the slick, overly dramatised way that it is on television, it must seem like a glamorous, heroic world, the criminal investigation department. In reality, it isn't like that. It is dark, brooding, intense, and it can be utterly soul-destroying. It is also exhausting, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and the higher up the ladder you progress, the more serious the crimes you're landed with, and the more onerous the weight of responsibility, until finally you reach that ultimate zenith and nadir, the murder squad. Back in those days, we rarely used specialised homicide units. We tended to deal with unlawful killings as and when they occurred, forming separate investigation teams for each one, drawing our staff from the surrounding division's most dedicated and experienced detectives. Of course, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. The pressure of just one murder inquiry can be crushing, paralysing, even when you'd done as many as I had. But no, this story isn't about me. It's about a little boy called Andrew Conroy, and how he spent the last moments of his life stranded on the edge of this wretched wood, probably knowing all the fear that every child anywhere has ever suffered, not to mention all the pain and humiliation, with nobody there to help, nobody even to call out to. It's also about the person responsible for that, and how he's still walking around, and all because I failed in my police officer's duty. I stand there dabbing at my eyes with my handkerchief. Pathetic, hopeless, a futile gesture, I hear you say, and you're right. I don't need to glance down at the floor of the shrunken clearing and see the tiny curved twig-like object, or rather not see it, as I have and haven't on every occasion I've been here since 1975, including that very first day when the darkening woods were filled with radio static and the yipping of dogs and the hushed mumble of voices. I don't need to look, because it will still be there, and it won't, as it always is and isn't. A tiny curved fragment of twig, easy to overlook in the heat and emotion of the moment and the general mass of forest rubble that litters our English woodlands. As I amble back out of the trees, I feel the burden of guilt lift a little, not because I've achieved anything by coming here, aside from my serving another day of penance, but more because the proximity of events is that little bit further away, because one more year has elapsed, because the faces and the facts are 12 months more distant. On the way out, I pass more sad evidence of our modern sophisticated age. As the wood thins out at the foot of the slope, I see the remnants of yet another den, this one at ground level, in fact below it. Apparently someone's dog once burrowed between the roots of an old sycamore tree in pursuit of a rabbit, and the rest of the gang quickly seized on the idea, going racing home for spades and trowels. All that remains of it now is a rank caved-in recess, its innards cluttered with wads of dead leaves, its entrance deep in stinging nettles. When it was first finished, they were able to conceal 2 or 3 of them in there at a time. I was told they took in their own props and roof supports, another roll of that ubiquitous carpet, not to mention candles, matches, boxes of apples and crisps, and yes, more well-thumbed girly mags. I give a wry smile as I make my tortuous way back up the hill. Girly mags again. Easy to see it now, but the kids back then weren't quite as innocent as we'd like to think. At the top of the slope, Jeff is still leaning on his car reading. He glances up as I reappear. Back in retirement then, are we? I nod, too breathless and my back too sore to think of a suitably witty rejoinder. You won't do yourself any good with this, you know, he says, shoving his newspaper into his pocket. Better just to let the past go. I nod, as I always do, but say nothing as I climb into the car alongside him. I am in the usual conundrum, thinking about my possibly having overlooked a vital clue. But even if I were to suddenly throw caution to the wind, pick up the phone and tell someone about it, and even if they were to react positively, which is highly unlikely given that I've now been out of the job for 11 years, it would be very much a case of closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. That might be a forced rationalisation on my part and an excuse, but it's also true, and that, in the absence of anything else, makes me feel a little better. Jeff was right in what he said earlier. I don't have anything to prove. This was the only murder case I failed to solve. There were at least 40 others when I got the right result. When I retired from the job, I did so after 35 years of exemplary service. After making detective superintendent, which was probably the highest rank someone of my working class background had any conceivable hope of achieving. But then my mind goes back to that little boy who, through personal circumstance I knew so well, and my heart bleeds for him. Then I think, isn't it true that we're really only as successful as our least successful moment? Aren't we only ever as good as our worst failure? And could it also be said that if your failure owes to more than simple negligence, then that doubles, trebles, maybe quadruples your culpability? As Jeff drives me away again, I can't help brooding on that tiny curved twig, which I saw so clearly in the flesh on that first occasion, and have seen again in my mind's eye ever afterwards, but have always denied and rejected and disbelieved as meaningless and insignificant. That innocent-looking twist of organic matter, which, instead of being a twig, might actually have been an apple stalk. And if that was the case, which might indicate that whoever dropped it there alongside the body had the very odd and unusual habit of eating the whole apple rather than leaving the core. Believe it or not, I feel relief as I depart this place. Children don't play here anymore. and as my son still lives in the area, I find that a very great relief.
Hello, my name's Simon Clark. I'm broadcasting from the depths of Yorkshire in England, and I shall be reading The Gravedigger's Tale, a story that was first published many years ago in Fear magazine, which was edited, published, produced by John Gilbert. The Gravedigger's Tale is inspired by many walks I've had in cemeteries through the years. I used to live quite close to a cemetery, and quite often on a fine day or even a dark and stormy day, I'd go for a walk around the graveyard looking at the old gravestones, some of them very ancient and some quite mysterious with a strange story to tell. And of course, walking through a cemetery does wonders for the imagination. And at one point, after one such walk, returned home and started making notes, wrote the first line, and suddenly the Gravedigger's Tale was starting to unfold. So here we go, the Gravedigger's Tale. "Jesus!" exclaimed the electrician as he levered the back of the hulking great chest freezer. "What did you have to dig them back up for?" Weather brown, whip lean, 60 plus, half-smoked cigarette behind one ear. The gravedigger grinned, displaying an even row of yellow splinters that had once been teeth. He leaned forward, bare wrinkled elbows resting on the freezer lid. "The new bypass. It's going to take half the graveyard yonder, so before they lay the new road, we have to lift the blighters and plant them in the new municipal ground up on Pontefract Road." Pulling a face, the electrician wiped the palms of his hands on his overalls. "Oh, there must have been some sights." "Well, they've been dead years, haven't they?" "Right. First one interred in 1836. So most of the coffins were rotted. As soon as you tried to lift them," he made a wet crackling sound, "they just folded like wet cardboard boxes, and everything spilled out into a heap. Just imagine that." The gravedigger waited for the young man's reaction. "Jesus." He wiped his mouth as if something small and extremely unpleasant had just buzzed into it. "You must have a strong stomach." The gravedigger recognised the inflection in the young man's voice. Disquiet, distaste, unease. He eyed the electrician up and down. The floppy white hat, slack mouth and wide-eyed gormless look signalled here's a lad who believes everything, every tall story that comes his way. You get that kind of kid on every factory floor, in every shop, everywhere, in every office, who when asked would conscientiously hurry to the foreman's stores to ask for the long wait or jar of elbow grease or pair of skyhooks. The gravedigger had been steeling himself for a dull afternoon of 10 woodbines, 5 cups of tea and a solo darts tournament in the cemetery store cum rest room. However, a faulty freezer and fate at her most obliging had brought entertainment in the shape of the young electrician in the floppy white hat. Someone who was, the gravedigger realised, as green as he was cabbage looking. "I'm just brewing up. You'll want a wet when you've done." "Oh, tar, milk and 2 sugars. Trouble is with this unit, it's been too near the window. Direct sunlight makes them overheat. Shouldn't take long, though." The young man looked round at the untidy brick flawed room, spades, shovels, picks, rusting iron bars leading to dusty corners, fading graveyard plans curled away from corrugated iron walls. At the far end stood a table cluttered with chip mugs, cigarette boxes, empty milk cans, and the greasy remains of a Cornish pasty. Overhead, an asbestos ceiling punctuated by dozens of tiny brown corpses, spiders that had died and been mummified by the dry air. The electrician asked, "Are the others out, digging?" "Oh, aye." The old man accurately tossed tea bags into 2 mugs. "They're working up topside, look." He pointed a yellow-brown finger that boasted a startlingly large black fingernail through a grimy cobweb window. 2 men could be seen digging in the graveyard. They hurled spadefuls of soil over their shoulders with cheerful abandon. "That's where they're going to plant James Hudson, the old mayor. Topside, you see, is where all the knobs are. Doctors, solicitors, aldermen, bank managers. Bottom side is for your working folk, paupers and the like. And that's where the new road's going through." The young man returned to his work, prizing at cables with a screwdriver, while whistling in a way that would make a saint curse. "Aye, that's where they've got to be dug up." The gravedigger licked his lips. "Disinterred. Exhumed, aye." Taking a kettle from the solitary electric ring, he limped to the freezer top, which he used as an impromptu table. There he filled mugs with boiling water. Then he paused. Dreamily he stared into the rising steam. "Aye, a bad business, this disinterring. You see some bad things. Oh, it makes you feel real poorly. In some of the older graves, well, we opened coffins and found what? Well, we opened coffins and found that the bodies had..." Once more his voice trailed away. The electrician's eyes opened wide. "Well," said the gravedigger, "they'd moved." Moved? The bodies had moved. "You see, sometimes years ago people got buried alive," said the gravedigger. "Not deliberately, of course. Expect some poor wretches were in comas so deep they were certified dead. They buried them. Of course, then they woke up." He glanced at the electrician to see if he appreciated its full significance. "Aye, buried alive. Just imagine. No light, no air. They'd be suffocating, trying to fight their way out. But 6 feet down, who would ever hear them? There in the grave, they screamed, they fought and clawed." At the lid, breathed up all the oxygen, and then... Well, you can picture what happened to them, can't you, lad? What did they look like? Clearly the electrician's imagination wasn't up to conjuring the macabre scene. The gravedigger shook his head. "Oh, terrible, just terrible. You see, in this part of Yorkshire, there are natural salts in the soil. They preserve the bodies buried here, only turns them yellow, bright yellow like a sunflower. Apart from the colour, they look the same as the day they died. Like this, eyes wide open." His face a distillation of pure terror, the gravedigger hooked his brown fingers into talons and contorted his body as if twisted by an unendurable agony. "Those buried alive, they just froze like that, like statues. But dear God in heaven, the expression on their poor faces. Jesus, that's awful. Oh, I've seen worse, lad." "What's the worst you've ever seen?" The man gulped his tea. "Oh." The electrician sighed. "That'd be 2 days ago, when we disinterred Rose Burswick. The moment we opened the coffin lid, we saw... Oh, no. The gravedigger shook his head gravely, slapped the teeth and scratched his leathery ear. No, it's so bad. I can't bring myself to... No. But he did go on to describe others in lurid, eye-watering detail. Old Walter Whetson. My uncle was gravedigger when they planted him. Summer of 1946 it was. Whetson was the fattest man in Hemsworth. 30 stone or more. It took so long to build a coffin that the meat flies got to him. Last week when we opened his coffin up, it were like opening up a box of long grain rice. Couldn't see him. Just this mound of maggots. Mummified they were. They were all hard and white like dried rice. Then it rained. My God, I'll never eat rice pudding again. Look. The gravedigger pointed at something small and white on the brick floor. There's one of the maggots. Must have trod it on 'em in my boots. The gravedigger watched with satisfaction as the young man nervously peered at the white morsel. Oh Christ, him loosened his shirt collar. Awful. The gravedigger continued. Then there was... Well, he had more stories about graves involving worms, rats, even rabbits. You see, the rabbits had tunnelled down and built nests in the coffins, and we found the baby rabbits scampering about inside empty cages. And there were grisly yarns about valuable jewellery lodged in backbones, about pennies and eyes. Oh, of course, when the eyelids dried, they stuck to the pennies. You lifted the pennies, then back to maggots and mole nests in skulls. And that's when the gravedigger noticed the young man's attention had wandered. He'd even finished replacing the freezer bag plate and swigged off his tea without really taking any notice of what he was being told. Time to play the ace. Sighing, the gravedigger lit the butt that had been tucked snug behind his ear. He blew cigarette smoke up into the air as he remembered something awful. You know, I can't get the last one we dug up out of my mind. Aye, Rose Burswick. The electrician's eyes focused on the gravedigger. You mean that really awful one? Aye, lad, the worst. Sombre-faced, yet inwardly gleeful, the gravedigger tragically put his head in his hands. The worst ever, and I've seen some terrible things in my time. The young man was hooked. Why? What happened? Well, lad, promise me you'll tell no one. You can trust me, mister. Remember the old factory down by the river? Yeah, that's the one that got sealed off with those radiation warnings. Radiation warnings all over the place. That is because during World War I, the gravedigger jabbed the glowing tab for emphasis. That's where they painted luminous faces on watches, ship's instruments and such like. Huh? Back then, lad, they used radium to make things glow in the dark. And radium is radioactive. They took girls 14, 15, 16 to apply this stuff to watches and compasses. Of course, way back when, nobody knew what radiation did to you. Most of the factory girls were dead before they were 20. Just rotted away as they worked. Rose Burswick Was there 20 years. And she just rotted away as she used a little brush to paint the radium onto watch faces. Trouble is, it dried quick. So she'd lick the brush every 2 minutes to keep it moist. Every time she did that, she must have swallowed a few flakes of radium. My God, it's a wonder it didn't kill her. The gravedigger shrugged. But it did. At least that's what the doctors said. In 1935, Rose Burswick was buried. She was 36. The lad grimaced. Bet she was a mess, living that long after. Aye, but that's not the worst of it. Like I said, 2 days ago we opened the grave. Oh, what did you find? The gravedigger rubbed his eyes. He was trying to erase a terrible image. Well, we lifted the coffin. It were intact. It was then I noticed something strange. Where the lid met the coffin, there was like this pale yellow trim round the edge. Funny, I thought. But really it was just a bit of mould. Anyway, we came to prise the lid off. It just flew off. Bang! Like the top popping off a jack-in-a-box. Jesus, Johnny! And inside it were full, ram-jam full to the brim. The electrician rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth, as if a bad taste oozed across his tongue. Full of what? The gravedigger shrugged. Why, it were full of Rose Burswick. He pulled on his cigarette hard. They say she weighed 6 stone when they buried her. But when we opened that coffin, it was like opening a carton of ice cream. There was just this big block, bright yellow. It had grown and grown until the coffin sides had stopped it growing any bigger. But even then the pressure had been so great inside the coffin, that yellow stuff had been forced through the crack between the lid and the coffin, making the yellow trim. Of course, we just thought it was some kind of fungus, so we tipped it out. It came out like a banana jelly from a mould. On the grass was that yellow block, moist, glistening, coffin-shaped. The young man shuddered. What had happened to Rose Burswick? Oh, that's just it. It was Rose Burswick. How? Mutation. The gravedigger rolled the syllables around his mouth like a juicy morsel. Mutation. You see, the radium caused her to mutate in the grave. The coffin had become a second womb. Aye, and she like gestated. She evolved into something that was not human. Did you touch it? Not on your Nelly. We ran like hell, but when the cemetery board found out, we had to go back to it. The gravedigger leaned back against the freezer. And do you know what we found there? The young man shook his head. We found it had changed. Just sort of become a soft mound. And it had grown. It had swelled and swollen. Oh, I tell you, that shook us to the core, it did. You see, Tuesday was that sunny day, scorching hot. The heat must have brought it on, and it was growing fast. Jesus, what then? We tried to lever it into a skip to take it down to the creme. Burn it. But this soft mound of a thing had taken root. Mutation had caused what left of the intestine to grow and to worm its way into the earth, just like a long yellow snake. It ended up as taking a shovel to it then cutting through the fleshy tube. It screamed. Pain, real pain. God, it were like a living nightmare. Then there it were, up and moving like I don't know what were left of her arms and legs had turned into swollen yellow stumps, with back to front feet and hands that had twisted up into hooves. I tell you, lad, utterly revolting. It were growing dark, he continued, and we were trying to get this thing into the hut. Then we noticed the worst part. I held a torch to it and studied it up close. That this yellow stuff, almost transparent, like yellow jelly. I could see inside of it. The young man's eyes bulged. What did you see? Terrible. Just under the surface, maybe 4, maybe 6 inches down through the thick jelly, I could clearly see, Rose Burswick's face. Or what was left of it. Wide staring eyes, coming out of their sockets, 3 inches or more, like red raw sausages. The tongue long, thrusting out of the mouth, up through the skin until the top wiggled all pink and wet above the surface. Aye, and the mouth. Good God, the mouth, opening shut in like this. Wordlessly, he solemnly slapped his lips together like a goldfish. You know, I reckon she was trying to say something. Call for help, a desperate cry for mercy. I reckon she was trying to say something to us. You know, that expression on her face will stick in my mind forever. Sheer terror, like a continual state of shock, as if she knew what had happened. Mutation. That and being buried alive. The young man asked perhaps what was an obvious question. What happened to it? What happened? Why? It kept growing. So we had to find a way to stop it. And how? Oh. The electrician trailed off in horror, as if guessing. The old man said, Sub-zero temperatures. The gravedigger tapped the freezer lid with a nicotine. The gravedigger tapped the freezer lid with his finger. Why else do you think a cemetery store would keep a freezer? He began to lift the lid. Look! No! The electrician's voice rose to a shriek, slamming the part-open lid down, his eyes tightly shut. No! Enjoying himself hugely, the gravedigger kept a straight face. But he couldn't keep the mischievous twinkle from his eye. Suit yourself. The young man said, I've got to go, I'm late. The electrician snatched his screwdrivers and pliers together, bundled them into his toolkit, then holding onto the limp white hat, ran from the building. The electrician was starting the van when the gravedigger breathlessly hobbled up. Hey, oh, my leg's giving me jip. Hey, you've forgotten this. The gravedigger waved a spool of copper wire in the air. The young man said, Oh, tar. Opening the door, he tossed the reel into the back. The gravedigger fixed the young man with a look. You know, as long as the freezer's working, he said, nothing'll happen. Old Rose Burswick is frozen solid, like a block of ice cream. Something occurred to the electrician. Wait a minute. How long since the freezer packed in? Oh, let's see. I saw some water on the floor yesterday. Ah, yesterday morning. But Bill said not to bother, it'll only be... Jesus! The freezer's been off for more than 24 hours. You're lucky he didn't thaw. The young man suddenly fixed the gravedigger with a fierce stare. Tell me you've switched it back on now. The freezer. You've got it on fast freeze, right? No. I haven't touched the thing. Thought you did. The electrician recoiled in shock. It's still switched off. My God, just pray we're in time. He jumped out of the van and hurried back in the direction of the hut, the gravedigger trailing behind and grumbling about his dicky leg. Too late. Much too late. They heard a noise from inside, just like dozens of loose boards being knocked over, a succession of thumps, a crash of mugs hitting the floor. Then with a loud crunch, the twin doors burst open, and what had once been Rose Burswick swelled and flowed out onto the path, a mass of quivering yellow, the size of a beached whale. It moved as fast as a man can walk. The gravedigger hollered a warning to the electrician, turned, then ran. The limp forgotten, he sprinted across the cemetery, leaping over headstones at such a hell of a speed it would have drawn murmurs of approval from any 200 metres hurdle champion. Luck had deserted the electrician. Stumbling backwards over a mound of soil, he slipped and fell into Mayor Hudson's grave-to-be. Down at the bottom of the pit, the electrician opened his eyes to darkness. For something had blocked out the daylight. Looking up, he saw that covering the grave like a lid was the gelatinous yellow form of Rose Burswick. Briefly, the sun shone through the yellow to reveal shapes suspended in the translucent body. Those shapes resembled fruit suspended in a dessert jelly, an arm, a leg, splinters of bone, distended internal organs, and a head. The head turned in the jelly, rotating slowly and smoothly and remorselessly until its face was gradually turned to the electrician. The face, that expression. On the far side of the cemetery, the gravedigger, busily scrambling over a brick wall, heard the muffled scream. He wanted to go back and help the lad, he really did. But fear drove him from the cemetery as fast as his legs could carry him. Back in the grave, the electrician's eyes were fixed on that face as Rose Burswick plopped down into the hole. After more than 60 years of solitude in a cold and lonely grave, Rose Burswick hugged the handsome young man in the floppy white hat. She hugged him in an embrace that seemed to last forever and ever, and the expression on her face remained in the electrician's memory, as if burnt there by fire. She was smiling. Sleep well, everybody.